Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the After the Timeout podcast, sponsored by the IBCA. We are a global podcast that shares the passion for the coaching profession. You will hear the stories of coaches from all around the world. We are covering the profession in game, outside of the game, and anything in between. As always, thank you for listening. We look forward to sharing the coaches' stories with you.
We are back with another episode of the After the Timeout podcast. We have a great guest today, Matt Hackenberg, basketball coaching consultant, zone offense guru as of recently. Great Twitter follow. Coach, thank you so much for joining us. How you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. I'm excited to be on with you guys.
Well, we really appreciate it. So we start everybody with the opening tip. Just a little bit about your career, your journey, and then kind of how you got to where you are now in consulting stuff.
So I had played basketball my whole life, and I had played in high school for my father at a smaller Christian school, and then went on to play college basketball. I played 4 years at Kentucky Christian University. That was a great experience for me. Immediately after I finished playing basketball, I started coaching, which led off with a 3-year stint as an assistant coach at a rural public school here in Ohio. From there, I was able to get my first head coaching job at the age of 26 at a smaller private school. I spent 4 years there and then moved on to a bigger public school in Glen Oak. So I'd spent my life mostly revolving around playing or coaching the game of basketball.
So we wanted to get into, we've had people from all over the globe with just different roles, and as a coaching consultant, kind of post your coaching time, kind of what made you want to get into that consulting role, and then let's start there, and then I'll do the follow-up. Kind of what made you want to get into that role?
Well, I'd been doing it for a while and I kind of stumbled into it by accident. And what happened was I was, posting some videos on YouTube, really trying to help my own basketball program because I wanted to have demonstrations for my youth coaches to be able to use so that they could integrate our schemes into their teams at the lower levels. So I posted videos on YouTube, and coaches from all around the world started watching those videos, and they started to email me about the concepts. And I still think it's cool that anybody cares what I think about the game of basketball. But, when it first started happening, I was, I would sit down and I would write out these 30-minute, 45-minute, detailed responses to these coaches that were curious about the videos that they'd seen. And that was really neat until it started to happen so frequently that it was disrupting the time of my life where, I felt like I was spending too much time responding to these coaches and not enough time doing some of the other things that I needed to do. So I started to kind of templatize those responses, and I eventually turned those into what would become a product on my store, where I added some graphic design and basically just made it exhaustive in terms of, everything I know about the concept. So that started going well enough where I really decided that I was making enough sales through this store accidentally with really no plan behind it other than to kind of preserve my time, that I would get on a production schedule. And I got on a production schedule where I started to make YouTube videos 3 a week, and I started to tweet every day, and I started to write a new product for my store every month. And I did that for a couple of years, and the results of that are, populating a store full of products that coaches could consume, and it built me an audience on Twitter with what is now X. And then I've got a whole library of videos for coaches on my YouTube. So it was really just having enough success on accident to realize that if I really put a plan behind what I was doing, there was a lot more potential, and that's turned out to be true. But it really just started with a commitment to do a few certain things over a sustained period of time that really got this thing going.
Well, that's all right. As we usually tell our guests off the air, I'll say on the air. Todd and I started this podcast during COVID, and we weren't sure who would listen. And we found out people would listen. So we kind of understand the accidental on purpose approach, I guess you'd say.
And that goes with a lot of things where it's like a lot of people are really focused on the outcome of what they're going to do, but ultimately it's really just the commitment to get started and do stuff. And then a lot of times you're pleasantly surprised with the outcome when you just do the actions over and over and over again.
With that train of thought, the second part of this is kind of what are those difficult questions you find to answer that you receive? I'm sure you get a ton of questions, a ton of things that coaches are reaching out. What are maybe the things you I don't want to say struggle with, but are more difficult to answer?
I would say things are just so specific to each individual. And, I'm getting 20, 30 messages a day from coaches, just random stuff through the different, comments and email and messaging systems from all these platforms. So it's just trying to like figure out where each person is when they're bringing you something they think you can help them with. It really is, it's challenging to try to relate to people that are at all different walks in their basketball coaching journey looking for solutions. So it's really just the variety of things that I see where so many different coaches are asking me so many different things. Even though I have a lot of core topics that I post about online, it's not always those topics that I'm getting the questions on. It's stuff all over the place in terms of coaching.
And then maybe coming up, what are things you're still working on that you want to help coaches? You're just not there yet.
Well, when I think about like my approach to doing things, I think I'm really good at getting content out there so people know who I am and what I do. And I think kind of the next step would be to get more deeper content out where I can build some trust with coaches and build deeper relationships and giving them the chance to listen to me talk for longer extended periods of time, just like this podcast. But it might even be just, YouTube videos that aren't showing an offensive scheme 3 different times, but it's, a 45-minute deep dive of listening to me talk and how I think about the game of basketball.
So we're gonna go to your playing career here, Coach, and tie this in. Coach said he played for 4 years, but he didn't give himself any credit. Right? Coach was a really good player. We did a little homework. 2,000 plus point scorer, over 1,000 career assists. So I wanted to talk to you about how you make and teach decision making in the game, right? Because we see games all the time. It's 1,000 decisions over and over again. So when you were playing, like how did you develop those decision making skills and then take it into coaching with your players, when to shoot, when to rip, whatever it may be? How did you kind of tie that all in from your excellent playing career where you did those things to coaching?
Well, I think it was two completely different things. And when I think about my playing career, I think about the progress that I made as a player, and I can attribute a lot of that to finding a really good balance between working on my body and between playing in games and between doing skill work, where I was doing a lot of that, and I feel like I didn't overdo any of it. So there was a good balance where I was building skills with my skill work, and then I was able to test them in play. And I think kind of the common thing now is that there's more play and more games and less skill work involved in player development. So I really think about, being able to kind of what they would say, get in the lab and work on things and test things, and then be able to use those in games, and not necessarily like a travel ball or AAU setting, but playing against like older players at the local community where I was just at a disadvantage from a strength and maturity standpoint. So I was my skills were kind of overloaded just going against older, quicker, stronger guys. So I think that's how I developed more as a player. And as I got more into my coaching career, I started to use more drill progressions and able to teach decision making. So starting things with one-on-one games to teach players different skills where they're working either with no advantage or a small advantage, and then kind of progressing that into 2-on-2 work and 3-on-3 work where you're adding in more layers of reading a help defense, understanding when to transfer the ball. So I would say that in teaching it, I think it's definitely a progression that I learned where you're starting with just one-on-one skills and then building that out into other kind of small-sided games where you're able to, as a coach, kind of manipulate the reads that a player would need to make. And through using small-sided games, you're able to get a lot of reps in a shorter period of time.
So we're going to delve into zone offense stuff in the second half of the episode, but this is a topic Todd and I off the air even talk about so much, which is how do you know when things are in your system are just too much? You know, I went through your zone stuff and I pulled out so many things from it, but at some point I even said to myself like, oh, okay, Jon, like you're pulling out a ton. So you know, the first half is maybe how do you know when it's too much? And then how do you know when to start to scale back a little bit?
Well, I think a lot of coaches lack discipline, and I think a lot of coaches, including myself, they want to be prepared for a lot more things than they need to be. So, I package a big product like my zone offense encyclopedia, and it's got all these things in it, but I'm very clear on kind of the structure on how I think coaches should use it in terms of generating a playbook of, anywhere from 4 plays to 8 plays or something like that. So while there may be hundreds of things to look at, a coach really has to have the discipline to not be able to implement so much that it takes away from the quality of output of the things that they do choose to install. So I think it really comes down to just coaches being able to understand that, if they're going to put something in, that's kind of a mental tax on the player. And the more stuff, when you start ballooning that playbook, you end up doing a lot of stuff, but nothing really at a high level. So I had an experience in my coaching career where I started doing some off-season work where I was kind of evaluating our teams, and I would go through each play that we ran, and I was charting like how successful it was in creating the shot that we wanted and how often we were scoring off of it. And this is before there was, analytics available. This is just me like hand charting stuff. And I'd found that I'd installed, maybe 5 or 6 plays, and we'd only ran each of them, 2 or 3 times all season. And at that point, I kind of asked myself, what am I doing? I'm adding all these plays. It takes time to install them. It takes time to maintenance them. We're not getting anything out of them. We're not even using them in a higher volume. And at that point, I kind of made more of a commitment to shrink the playbook, do less stuff, try to do the things that we're doing better, and not just add stuff on an impulse. A lot of times I think coaches, especially in the day and age, especially when there's people like me feeding you constant information on Twitter, that they can see some shiny object of, UConn running this play, and all of a sudden the next day in practice, you're installing it because it looks so good online. So I think we as coaches need to kind of avoid that shiny object system and kind of stay clear. And it's not that you don't need to intake new information. I think it's very important that you take in new information, but from what gets taken into what you're installing, I think there should be a very thoughtful process and not just do things on impulse.
So just to follow, let's say you're a high school coach, you're running your high school program, boys, girls, whatever, and it's April and you're sitting down, you're preparing for the summer work and you've done this, things XYZ on offense and you're moving to XYZ on offense. How much time do you feel you want to be able to put in, whether it's for the basic concepts or the motion or those things, just when you're sitting down and trying to almost like forecast this is what we're going to do in the summer, this is what we're going to do in the fall preseason, this is how we're going to prepare. What do you say to coaches that are going to say, Coach Hackenberg, you have amazing stuff, how do I start by implementing, how do I start by deciding what fits for my personnel?
Yeah, I think that the off season is the optimal time to do it, where you can really sit down and think and plan when you don't have as much going on the court. So I think you really want to start now with your planning period. And for your base concepts, I think that what really matters is kind of what you have already. I've taught this circle motion for a long time, and I remember like the third year that we were running circle motion, I had allotted this big chunk of time to like teach the offense and to go over some of the nuances of it. And it was our first practice, and I started to install it, and I had 45 minutes blocked off, and we were through with all I wanted to teach in about 15 minutes. And that was because the kids had been running the offense for multiple years at the lower levels. And what I was feeling like I needed to teach almost from scratch, they had a lot of the stuff already figured out. So I think that you kind of, if you're having a vertically aligned, seamless integration in your program, I think that your players can end up handling a lot more because they're picking up a lot more on their way up through your program, as opposed to if you're just working on like single pods of teams where like your varsity team is doing one thing and your JV team is doing another thing and your freshman teams are doing another thing. So I think having that vertical alignment is like a cheat code in building high school basketball teams. It's not that easy to do, and you really have to be organized, because when you're looking at different offenses or schemes to use, what you should really be considering is not just my varsity team, but all the levels below it. Because if it's really a concept that you want to dive into and have become an identity of your program, it shouldn't just be your varsity team running it. It should be all the different levels of your program. So I think if it's something brand new that you're pivoting to, you got to start that in the off season with some small-sided game work or something like that to kind of break down the offense, and then have kind of a slow progression as you get into your season. But if it's something that you've already got implemented at the lower levels of your program, I don't think you have to allocate as much time for it.
All right. So you just talked about picking a system a little bit, right? I think when you said that's your resume, you said fun to coach, fun to play, and fun to watch, right? So when you developed that, right, what was that like an accumulation of? Was it accumulation of your couple years where you're like, yeah, no, this didn't work, or this ain't fun? And then maybe dive a little bit deeper into like when you did it, what you were looking at as player specific traits, athletic traits, right? Because size, whatever it may be, to get it to where you could still use it no matter who you had in your program.
Yeah, so that's interesting to think about, and I think that there's a lot of experimentation that goes on. And when I started my coaching career, I was using what I call Wave, which is the Euro ball screen offense, and I love that offense and what we developed that offense into, and to having some motion reads with the two-man games we were running, and I thought the kids could really play with synergy with one another, and they understood how to use their skill sets within the offense. And I had a point where I felt like I was just too dependent on ball screening and the drive and kick kind of game. So I really wanted to go on an exploration to find more passing, cutting, screening, off ball kind of movement and screening. And what I found was these two offenses that I talk about quite a bit online. And one is this circle motion, and the other is called bear. And those are kind of the two offenses that I really dove into for this off-ball screening and cutting type of basketball that I shifted towards. But in between then, there was also a phase where I was running a 5-out screen away motion. And I liked that. I liked the vision of what that could become, but it ended up not really being a solution for us. So what I did was make a compromise in terms of pivoting off of the 5-out screen away motion into circle motion. And what that allowed us to do was still play with those 5-out concepts, but in a more simplified manner, where the ball's getting to the wing and there's certain reads that you need to make, but it wasn't as loosely defined where it is as like a full motion in 5-out. So I felt like that was a really important discovery, and it all came through just the trial and error of deciding to switch from an overall philosophy of on-ball screening and drive and kick kind of play into this open post passing and cutting type of play. And then there's this kind of learning period in between where I thought I was on the right track, but I needed to find a tweak, in that going from that 5-out screen away motion to the circle motion ended up being the right tweak, because it simplified the reads for our kids and they didn't have to be, as good at all the reads from all the spots as they would have had to be in that 5-out screen away motion.
All right, so let's do this then. Say, right, circle motion. We've seen it. You do a great job of looking at it. What if you got a 6'10" kid that can go to work in the post? You know what I mean? Like, how do you maybe incorporate some of that of your ideas into that and adjust when you have that special player, right? Or it could be a guard. It could be whatever it may be.
Yeah, and that's you've got to make overarching decisions for your program that aren't going to be the best decision for every single kid. You can't make a decision that's the best thing for every single kid in your program because that would look different. But you also can't flip-flop with your schemes every single year because then you're just kind of an amalgamation of a bunch of different concepts instead of, really having depth to anything that you do. So to answer your question is, I had a kid that played for me that just broke Mount Union's all-time scoring record, a 6'6" post player, and he could shoot the ball, but he really didn't go off the dribble very well. But our main offense when he played for us was the 5-out circle motion, and he would stumble into some three-pointers into that offense. But really what the adjustment was is that all of our ATOs, all of our set plays, all of our baseline out of bounds were kind of funneled through him, where I felt like those were the opportunities to really feature him on the inside on the low block. And then the circle motion kind of belonged to the rest of the team, where everybody was feeling like they were involved because the ball's moving and everybody's making decisions and everybody's cutting. And I thought that that actually gave us a tremendous balance to our team, where everybody knew who the man was on our team. Our main offense reflected something everybody could get involved with. But we also knew when it was time to, walk the ball up and run a set play, we were going to feed the big dog inside. So I think you can do all kinds of things like that if you're thoughtful. And, I don't think just because your main guy has a certain set of skills that automatically means you have to pivot off of what you've been building, for years in the making.
All right, so we're going to go into zone offense here. We call this halftime adjustment. So I'm just going to start with, before we get into more details, kind of diagnosing your needs for your zone offense, right? Obviously, you could have scouting, right? In your conference, maybe somebody plays a 1-3-1, whatever it may be. But when you kind of look at your zone offense, how do you kind of diagnose, okay, this is what we need, this is what fits? Because for our listeners, Coach, the encyclopedia is literally encyclopedia, right? There's so much you can do. Obviously, you never would do all that as one team, but how do you kind of diagnose what you need and get it down to the nitty gritty and really teach it?
Yeah, and I think the first thing that you need to do is kind of understand the scope of what you need to accomplish individually, because, I've coached in leagues where hardly any zone was played at all. And we didn't need to have some extensive zone package. We certainly needed to have some solutions because we might run into it in some non-league situation or something like that. But I know that there's all kinds of areas of the country that zone is played a ton. So I think you kind of need to come into it thinking about, how big of a process do I need to go through to find solutions for zone, because that scope changes based on where you're at. And then when I think of it, it is, first you've got to start with some kind of base zone offense. And usually that's a concept that you would default into whenever you would see zone. So you don't want a situation where a team goes zone and your kids are looking over to the sideline waiting for you to make a call. Like, you want to have an automatic that you're going to get into. And usually this is what I would define as something that's a conceptual offense or a continuity offense. And those are used because they can be used in higher volumes against zone. They can be used for a lot of possessions. So if you were seeing zone for just 1 or 2 plays, you could get through those 1 or 2 plays with set plays against zone. But if you were seeing zone over the course of an entire game, you can't have 50 different set plays. You need something that you can run over and over and over again that can produce shots for you. So I think you start a zone playbook by having a base look that everybody knows that you're going into whenever you would see zone. And that might be the same thing for a 2-guard front zone as opposed to an odd front zone. But sometimes those are different concepts. Once you have your kind of base layers of automatic, what we're going to get into when we see zone, then you start to branch off into some set plays. And set plays you can't use in quite as high a volume. So if we're going to have a nice set play against a 2-3 zone, we can't usually come down and run that 5 times in a row. It's going to lose its effectiveness. The defense is going to start to understand how to overshift to solve the dilemma that we're trying to cause with our set play. So you need to have a mix of your base play with some set plays, and then you want your set plays to kind of reflect the things that your personnel can do. And I like to have maybe a group of 5 set plays against zone each year, and they're very kind of specifically picked to target the skill sets of the players that we have, where we might have a duck-in set play designed to get our 6'6" kid an isolation on the block, or we might have some shooter sets where we're setting flare screens or running some misdirection for our shooters, or we might have a ball screen set if we've got kind of a jitterbug point guard that can collapse the defense and move the ball from there. So I think the answer to your question is to first solve the problem of what do we do when we see zone, what's kind of our base concepts that we could rely on, and then branching off into set plays that really feature your personnel in specific ways so that they can get shots that they prefer as a player, kind of in the spot of the court that they like to operate. And that's one of the good things about playing against zone. You really get to dictate, who guards who, because the zone stays in their area. So you can put your players, in terms of finding the best matchup for them on the court.
So as we get into the second half of the episode and we really start to expand on zone stuff, you kind of started to talk about the foundation. But I think, there's a lot of coaches out there, and, you and I kind of just touched base on this before the episode, but, one of the reasons I kind of like some of your zone stuff in the 5 out was it kind of connects to our man stuff, which is also in the 5 out. So, how much different, let's say you're playing man, the other team's playing man, you're kind of beating it pretty good. They go to zone. How much different do you want those concepts to be? Do you want your man and zone offense to look completely different? Do you want it to have them be somewhat vertically aligned, kind of as you talked about? How much do you want them to be different?
I think that it is a bonus when you have that kind of overlap where you don't have to change as much going from man to zone. But the reality is that there's a different set of principles that work against zones that work against man to man. So I don't think it's an absolute necessity. And I can give you the example of like circle motion where, that's our base offense against man to man. And I really liked it against 3-2 zones, but I didn't specifically love it against 2-3 zones. So I would use it as a solution against 3-2 zones. But if we were going against a 2-3 zone, we would be looking at something completely different that wasn't like circle motion. So I felt like, it was a bonus that I could kind of carry over our base man-to-man offense into an option to attack 3-2 zones, but I didn't feel like I was bound to it to kind of force it into playing against a 2-3 zone when I didn't love it. And I thought that there was kind of some other solutions that would fit our team better.
All right, so let's talk about our thoughts on shot selection in zones, right? Because a lot of times you see, oh, well, we got to get him out of it, we got to shoot him out of it, whatever it may be. So what are you looking at based on what you're running for your shot selection? Obviously, yes, dependent on your team and things like that, but just in general, what kind of shots are you looking for?
So I think the general consensus is that, there's a lot of settling for outside shots against zones. And I definitely felt like when I was putting the Encyclopedia Zone offense together and doing some self-reflection on my own coaching, that I felt like I was a lot dependent on the perimeter and that I built a lot of our zone offense around our shooters. And I think there's a really good way to balance that out when you kind of look at concepts in a certain way. If your base offense is trying to establish a high low to work, That can present kind of an inside style of play to attack a zone. And if you're doing that, then it might make more sense to use your set plays as kind of a perimeter oriented thing. So I think you want to see what you're really accomplishing with your base offense selection and then build around that, but make sure that you have ways to shoot shots closer to the rim. And the way that I do that is through, having a lob play, a set play for a lob. It's a set play that involves some interior screening to get the ball inside. It might be a duck in set, or it might be an overload set. But I think you really want to be considerate that you're not falling too in love with shooting from the outside to beat a zone, but that you have ways to manufacture shots in close to the basket. And it might be through these set play calls where you can get the ball close to the rim based on a specific action that you're calling out.
So I guess how are we gonna break it down then? Like ideally for you, how many touches you trying to get in the paint versus the high post versus sets for a shooter? Like what do you think kind of balances out ideally?
I think you're really talking about in-game adjustments while you're coaching and how your team is responding. They might be playing with a good balance while they just attack the zone with your normal stuff, but then you've got your pulse on your team, where if you're seeing that they're standing around and they're not penetrating the zone, then you have a card in your back pocket where you can call your ball screen set to kind of force them to penetrate the zone. So I think it's really a reaction. You have your options based on the plays that you've chosen, and then being able to kind of have a feel for how your team's playing and force them to get some of the shots that you might be looking for if they're settling for other shots. So like if our team is shooting too much from the outside, then you're calling a lob, then you're calling the interior screening, or you're calling an overload set play, just to kind of find a better balance to make sure we're not just shooting 3-pointers, that we're also trying to work the ball in around the basket.
So, just an interesting follow is, how much time should coaches be spending on their zone offense in practice? I think it's unique, and one of the reasons I run a unique zone defensively myself is just because not a lot of people prepare for an amoeba, and it gives us a little bit more time to work on offensive skill development. Or a friend of mine who runs a 1-3-1, I know runs it because not a lot of people spend a lot of time on 1-3-1 defense or offense, because you're only going to see it maybe 1, 2, 3 times a year. So how much of daily practice do you feel we should be denoting to zone defense, or excuse me, to preparing for a zone defense as coaches?
Well, I hate to do it to you, but I feel like it's it depends type of answer. And I think that what you're really looking for is, as a high school basketball coach, hopefully you have a scouting system built out. Hopefully you've got a film share program worked out with your conference where you have an idea of what you're coming into at these games. So I think it's good to practice zone offense generally, just in like a team offense block of practice. But then I think you really want to scale that up or down depending on the the tendencies of the upcoming opponents that you're playing. So if we were going to play your team on a Friday night and it was Wednesday, and we knew that we were going to see a lot of amoeba, we would obviously be amping up our zone offense teaching points and the amount of time that we're spending on it. But if we were going to play a team, that didn't play much zone, we might only hit it a little bit, and it might not be the focus of what we're doing. So I think it depends, and I think the best way to prepare is to kind of get ahead of your schedule, know what the tendencies of the teams are and your upcoming schedule, and then allocate more or less time depending on how much of a focus that is for the opponents that you're about to play.
So I want to follow on that a little bit then, because you kind of read my mind there, right? Like how far are you starting that process, right? Like you said, you could play. I think you said one year you played a team that was everybody was mad, right? And then and then all of a sudden maybe you got this one team coming up for zone, and maybe it's at the end of the year, and if you haven't done anything all year, you're gonna be in trouble, right? So in season, how are you looking at that? Like, do I throw a little bit of this in a week and a half before because I know we're playing this opponent?
Yeah.
And if you haven't seen it, how do you keep them fresh with it? Because you haven't seen that situation.
So I think one of the things that happens that coaches play zone. So like if my team has a zone defense installed, you naturally have a way to kind of work on your zone offense when you're installing your zone defense. So if you're like, splitting a varsity team in half and rotating reps, it might be focused on your team defense at that point, your zone defense, and you're getting zone offense, while you're doing it. So I think it's just a general good habit to just try to keep things sharp. And obviously, you wouldn't want to go through a whole season and just completely neglect zone offense, but just having the awareness of what's coming up on your schedule and being able to kind of, throttle it forward or pull it back, depending on, how much you think you're going to need it, is the best way to go, while kind of maintaining it along the way. And, only as a coach, how much you need just to keep your concepts sharp. But I don't think you want to get too far into the weeds in terms of not doing anything, or having it be a focus, even though that there's not teams coming up on your schedule that are going to show you very much of it.
So let's get a little bit deeper now into breaking down your zone offense into skills, whether it's passing into the high post or looking high low or shooting off an inside out, or all the things you've kind of hit on. But how do you break down your zone offense into skill development and drills to kind of build on those concepts and principles you have?
Yeah, so I like to work on zone in two ways. And the first is a 4-on-4 progression. And really what that teaches is the concepts that stress a zone. So no matter what plays you choose, there's a 4-on-4 progression that I talk about in the Encyclopedia of Zone Offense, where just through some basic kind of patterns that you put the players through, you're forcing them to make some of the decisions that are going to stress the zone, where you kind of have to start the possession engaging the defense, and it kind of trains your team over time to make sure they're kind of punching those gaps and they're getting it to a position where you're playing 5-on-5. Because oftentimes I see against zone offense, in zone offense, you've got players that position themselves out of scoring range. You've got guards that initiate the offense from too far out. And what happens is you're really only forcing a zone of 5 defenders to guard 4 people. So you got to make it, you got to do these little things where you're catching the ball and looking at the hoop, you're catching the ball within scoring range, you're engaging the zone. And we do that through a progression where you're basically kind of training the players. Okay, here's what you're allowed to do on this possession. And then we're going to play it out in a small-sided game that kind of forces the players to make those reads of the general concepts that work against zone defenses. And then from there, it becomes a 5-on-5 game where you're using constraints to work on your specific plays. So through the 4-on-4, you're only working on concepts that would apply to any play in zone offense. But through constraints, you can work on the specifics of your plays. And what that means is you would be going through possessions, but you would be giving your players limitations on what they can and can't do. So we're playing 5-on-5 live possessions, and I might be saying, on this possession, we have to get a touch on the baseline, a touch in the middle of the zone, and throw a skip pass before we shoot. And the defense doesn't know what we're doing. This is something that we're talking about in our huddle. But through that kind of constraint that we've put on them, now the players are getting comfortable understanding how to get the ball to the baseline, how to get the ball to the middle, and how to read the skip pass in the offense. So by using those kind of guided constraints, and there's all kinds of different constraints that you could use, you're teaching your play in more depth, and you're teaching your players to kind of read things in a different way. A lot of times what happens in practice is, a kid will just take kind of the first shot that's available. And when you use these constraints to force them to look for different elements of a play, they start to learn it at a little bit deeper level than just settling for the first shot. And, constraints that you could use is, you might say, we're only going to shoot the ball after we've hit the middle. So it kind of forces players to get not only to get the ball to the middle, but then, read the defense from there. And we know that we can't shoot even if we have an open shot without a middle touch. So it's these little ways that you can first of all, practice the concepts that work against zone, and then morph that into how do you work on your specific plays so that your players understand them with better depth and are ready to execute when the moment's called on.
So let's go thinking about what you're seeing and in the future here. So I'm gonna tweak this a little bit because obviously you don't put something together like the encyclopedia of zone offense without seeing a lot of film, seeing teams, looking at defensively what other teams are doing. So maybe let's talk defensively first. What kind of different things are you seeing with zone defenses that the teams are trying to adjust to? Something like what you're doing is the sets and things like that.
Yeah, I think I see a lot of things coming, that things always come in cycles. There's always fads with different things, but I think about like right now and how popular the Miami Heat have made playing zone, and Merrimack has their kind of unique zone that they're playing. So I think like when things like that happen, it tends to pull coaches in and they start to incorporate those kind of concepts into their system. So I think everything kind of runs in cycles where zone might not have been as popular for a while, but maybe it comes back in vogue more. So I think it really just it comes down to the trends of what's happening at the levels above high school level, and when teams start to depend more on it. If you see some that more of that in the NBA or in college, then all of a sudden you'll start to see more of it in the high school levels.
And then, I mean, is there anything specific you see? And then offensively, like, how are you going about that process too of like trying to adjust, right? Like looking at, okay, they're doing this, that, the other. You kind of always evolving. Maybe you see something new for the first time.
Yeah, and I mean, all the answers that I have to zone are in that encyclopedia of zone offense. So I think, from here I can start to kind of look and see what trends might be happening. But I think what's happening with the Miami Heat and with like the Merrimack zone is it forces innovation. It forces teams to get a little bit deeper with their zone offensive schemes. And this is always what happens in basketball is, something gets figured out and then there's always a response to it. If you just look in like the trends of the pace of play or the amount of 3-point shots that are taken, there's always some kind of response to it. And we're getting a little bit off track away from zone offense, but, teams started to shoot a lot more threes when they understood the math. And what did that do? That changed teams' defenses, where now, you never really heard much about running players off the line. We're intentionally now running hard at 3-point shooters to force them to dribble. And that's all a reaction to someone figuring out the math on the 3-point shot, what that can do for an offense. It's not only worth more points when you make it, but it also provides better spacing. So there's these reactions that all happen. And I'm kind of looking forward to, after spending, 4 months of my life really diving into zone offense, seeing what the kind of innovations are next with zone offense.
So as we move to our last two segments, the first one we call 30-second timeout. It's your opportunity to talk about whatever you want, yourself, your stuff in your store, maybe your next project, your current projects, turn the tables and ask Todd and I a question. Kind of the floor is yours, and that we promise there's no referee in your timeout telling you your 30 seconds is up.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just say, the first thing that I think about is the relationship I have with my dad. My dad's coached me, and how fortunate I was to kind of have that experience as being able to play for my dad. And I've never had my dad on any of my coaching staffs with me. He was kind of like an outside sounding board, but it really makes you think about just how important basketball is when you can share a game like that with another person over the course of a long period of time, and how special that becomes. I think on the creator side of things, I'm starting to work on some different projects. I don't know. My next big one I think I'm going to do might be on press breakers. So where I spent a lot of time really figuring out zone offense and laying out a big project on that. I think the next thing that I might get into is press breakers. That's kind of the thing that I think is very interesting to me, and that I could help coaches solve a lot of problems in terms of facing extended pressure in a variety of ways.
All right, last segment, quick hitters. Just kind of rapid fire random questions.
All right.
So since you were your great person assisting the ball, right? Favorite point guard of all time.
Um, you know, I love Steve Nash. My college coach would compare me to like a Darren Williams, or I was kind of like a physical guard in that nature. I really love Penny Hardaway. I love Stephon Marbury growing up. Those are the guys I'm going to go with.
No, he got me a Penny Hardaway. All right. So you're from Canton, Ohio. So who's your favorite Pro Football Hall of Famer?
I'm not a huge football guy. So I'll probably give you like your lamest answer that you've ever got on this question, but I'll go with like you know, Joe Thomas, a guy
Oh, that's fine.
You went with
drafted
an offensive lineman. I like
I
it.
like it.
drafted to the Browns, stellar career, solid play. Just to have the Browns and the Pro Football Hall of Fame both in Ohio and be able to enjoy that guy's career. That's what I'm going to go with. Joe Thomas, offensive lineman for the Browns.
I like it.
So you mentioned your first head coaching job at 26, right? Give us your best story from maybe that first year where it could be something goofy happened, something you weren't prepared for. You know what I mean? Because everybody, when they get their first head coaching job and they're young, there's a story there somewhere.
I'm going to go into my second year, and kind of a funny story is um, we were struggling in my second year towards the kind of back half of the season. We had lost 4 or 5 games. The kids were working hard. I was working hard. We just weren't getting the results. I was, down in the dumps about the results that we were getting. I'm questioning with my coaching staff if we're ever going to win another game. And we ended up, going off, ripping off some games to end the season. We got into the tournament and, ripped through our district. We beat some perennial powerhouse teams in the region and made it all the way to the state tournament. And we drive down to Columbus to play our state tournament our basketball game, our semifinal game. We pull into BW3s to stop and eat before our practice down in Columbus, and we've got all our kids emptying off onto the bus. We're walking in trying to get some wings, and the hostess gets on her walkie-talkie and she's like, "We got to get the table set up. We've got a swim team here that wants to eat." And swim team doesn't look anything like a basketball team if you're really thinking about it. And I felt like that was kind of the biggest compliment to what we were accomplishing, where we were down in Columbus to play this in the state tournament. We didn't really look the part. We were, skinny kids that weren't very tall, and that we were, playing so hard and playing such good defense and playing with such good fundamentals that we were able to achieve at a high level without, what would standard look like a state level high school basketball team.
So, you've been on multiple social media platforms. In fact, I had one of my assistants send me something from LinkedIn that you had posted on LinkedIn. So, of all the social media platforms you post on, which one do you enjoy the most?
They've all got their own charm to them. I would say Twitter and I guess now what's referred to as X is kind of the first place that I got traction. So it'll always be near and dear to my heart. And somehow I've picked up 30,000 followers on Twitter. So, in terms of volume, that's the biggest platform that I have. I've had some great interactions with coaches on Twitter. And now as I expand out and get onto other social media platforms to kind of share my content, it's all a little bit easier just because I think there's some recognizability of the content that I've been sharing on Twitter for so long. So I can't give you any other answer than Twitter at this point.
All right. The song you are listening to the most lately.
Music wise, I'm probably a country music guy, but honestly, when I'm in my car, I'm listening to podcasts, usually on 2 times speed. I'm trying to pick up on news, politics, sports, business stuff like that. So I'm not a big music guy, but if there is music playing, it'd be a country playlist.
All right. So you've been a consultant for a little while. You've been out of the game for a little while. So what would get you back into coaching, having your own team?
I love coaching, and I think that there's just seasons of your life that you go through. And I'm in one where I'm kind of building a business based on the knowledge and experience that I accumulated in my coaching career. And I do want to coach, but I don't want to coach so much that I do it at the wrong time in my life. So there's not only am I building a business, but I've got a young daughter that I've really enjoyed being able to spend more time with. And I think it really made sense for me to get out of coaching a few years ago when I made that decision. And I think that when the decision is right to get back in, I'll know it and be prepared for it. And through all this stuff that I'm doing right now, I'll be a much, much better coach for it.
So, Coach, before we close out, I know you have an abundance of things on the market, an abundance of ways you help your coaches. So, before we close out, we wanted to provide you the opportunity to maybe promote your social media or promote your products. So we'll kind of just give you a little bit here to kind of just promote yourself, let our listeners know where they can find your stuff, find you.
So I'm, spread out pretty good on most of the social media platforms. If you just search my name, you'll find me on most any of them. I have a store that's filled with products that I write. My main way to teach is kind of long form, detailed, technical basketball coaching guides that I write. If that's your style of learning, you'll enjoy my products. Kind of my headline product is an investment called Powerhouse Program Building, and it's basically me teaching how to maximize a basketball program at the high school level. And it just gives all kinds of different ideas that you could apply to your situation to kind of take your program from what it is now and turn it into its maximum potential. So I've had all kinds of, I've had hundreds of coaches go through that program. Now at this point, a lot of them have achieved just tremendous results. So I'm really excited to share that with anybody who's interested in really maximizing the basketball program that they have, or if they're a young coach looking to get their first head coaching job, there's all kinds of advice to just provide clarity on how you would want to build your basketball program, and also how to go through an interview process to kind of set yourself apart, when you might be going up against coaches that have more experience, or you might be at a disadvantage in terms of being able to get a job, but you can kind of shift the odds in your favor by doing some of the things that I suggest in there. So, young coaches looking to get their first jobs, or coaches that have a job and are looking to maximize it, that's a program that I would highly recommend. Some of the top sellers on my store are my Circle Motion offense product, my Wolfpack defense product. But there's all kinds of different things on there. There's about 40 different products on there. And I think we've really rounded out a great product line, where if you're looking for something very specific, whether it's, special situations or set plays or zone defenses or presses or culture, there's all kinds of solutions in that store. And if you're looking me up on any of these social media platforms, you'll probably find a link to my store not too far behind that.
Well, Coach, first of all, thank you for joining us. Listeners, I will speak for myself and myself only. I am a huge fan of Coach's stuff. He is definitely a follow on Twitter, definitely a person to check out his material. The things you get for the prices he charges are an absolute steal. So please go check out Coach's stuff. Coach, thank you for the 50 hour that you spent with us. I know our listeners will really enjoy it. So thank you again for your time today.
Hey, thanks for giving me a platform to communicate. I really enjoyed it. And if you guys need anything, just hit me up. I'd be happy to help you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the After the Timeout podcast in partnership with the IBCA. Please be sure to rate us on whatever platform you are listening and give us a 5-star rating. For more show content and updates, please follow us on Twitter at After the Timeout. As always, thank you for listening. Tune in next time for more content on the court, off the court, and anything in between.